Are you tired of setting up and putting away one of these portable water filters every time you go camping? How about one of these PRVs, or pressure reducing valves? Have you ever lost one? Have you ever left one behind by accident? How would you like to completely forget about them altogether, to never have to go back and set up or put one away when you go camping? If you're like me, one of your goals, unspoken or not, when you go camping is to spend as much time as you can with your family, soaking up the great outdoors. And sometimes when you're RVing, there's some pesky setup and teardown tasks that get in the way and take away from some of that enjoyment. So today's video is going to be all about a permanent water filter and PRV install on a budget, and it's DIY, so stay tuned. All right, let's jump right in. Let me answer the first question. Why do you need this mod on your rig? Now, if you've got a higher end unit, you may already have a water filtration system and PRV permanently installed on your rig from the factory. Now, that's more common with, higher end fifth wheels, Class A motorhomes, generally things that are gonna have an MSRP, let's just say over $60,000. Otherwise, most RVs from the factory do not have a water filtration system or PRV installed. And so we end up dragging one of these out and hooking them up each time, which brings us to the question, why do you need a water filter and PRV in the first place? If you plan to drink the water in your RV, you'll probably want some basic filtration just to make the water taste better. Now, I'm not talking about some kind of fancy reverse osmosis system, just something basic that takes the chlorine taste down and gets rid of most of the sediment. Secondly, a lot of campgrounds used galvanized pipes for their water lines, which can have rust and other sediment, and so you definitely don't want that coming into your rig through the city water connection. Now, I suspect most people watching this already know why it's a good idea to use a PRV on your rig when you go camping. But just to make sure, let me briefly touch on this. This is a PRV, a pressure reducing valve, and it basically steps down your water pressure to a more manageable 40 to 50 psi. So at a campsite, you might have water pressure coming out of the spigot that's over 100 psi, and that's so that that water pressure can feed all the different campsites at the campground you're staying at. And so this pressure reducing valve takes that 100 psi or higher water pressure and steps it down to 40 to 50 psi. You don't want an extreme, crazy high water pressure going into your rig, as that could cause a fixture to leak or a pipe to burst if it's constantly subjected to such a high water pressure. And so you want to protect your rig by using one of these PRVs, or pressure reducing valves. Now, if you recall, when you bought your first RV, they probably took you to the part shop afterwards, or maybe they even bundled a starter kit with your purchase, and they said, hey, you got to have a PRV just like this one here, and you got to have a water filtration system on your rig. But what if you didn't have to worry about setting those up and taking them down every time you went camping? If you're like me, you're constantly trying to figure out ways to simplify the process, to make it less complex, so that when you're out camping and spending time with your family, you're not bogged down with all the logistics and setup and tear down routines that come along with RV ownership. And so the install I'm going to show you today is something that I've done on several rigs, and I absolutely love it because I don't have to worry ever again about setting up a PRV, setting up a water filter. Don't have to worry about leaving one behind. I install it once and I'm done. Have I convinced you yet? We'll keep watching. Today I'm going to show you this install on two very different rigs, on my personal fifth wheel here and a smaller overlander style rig. And hopefully your rig will have some similarities to take away, but this is completely DIY. I mean, you can do this even if you've never tackled a plumbing project before. The first step is to plan out where you're going to locate the water filter and PRV. Now, here on the NoBo 10.6, the city water inlet connection is right here on the outside, and this is of course where you hook up your hose at your campsite. Now, on the fifth wheel, the city water connection is right inside here in the wet bay. Now, fortunately, both on the overlander and fifth wheel, we can get access fairly easy to the back side of the water inlet, which is key for this install. Now, if you don't have easy access to the backside of your city water inlet, don't stop watching yet. Many rigs have a hot water heater very close to the city water inlet on the outside with an exterior panel just like this one here. And then oftentimes inside your rig, there might be a cabinet with some kind of access panel where you can get easy access to the backside of your city water inlet. All right, this is a standard 10-inch water filter housing. This form factor has been around forever. It's used in residential applications all the time, and it is standardized. Now this one you can see is branded DuPont, but it's a standard form factor, which means you can get just about any replacement cartridge to go inside. So here's one example of a cartridge. This one's going to be a finer cartridge that will filter out more sediment and things like that. And then this one in here is more like a carbon filter, and it's going to be better at getting rid of some of the odors and tastes and things that are in the water. But again, any 10-inch standard water filter housing will be just fine. I will put links in the description below where you can get one very similar to this one here. But again, any standard 10-inch water housing is acceptable. All right, this over here is a PRV. It's a residential pressure reducing valve, and you probably have one very similar to this in your house already. You can get a 1/2 inch size or a 3/4 inch size. Now the 3/4 inch size is probably more readily available at your home center. And certainly this is heavier duty than the screw-on PRV that I showed you earlier in the video. But what's nice about this residential PRV is you can dial it to the exact water pressure desired. And it's way more robust than that basic screw-on PRV. So altogether, you need enough room to accommodate both the filter housing and the PRV. Basically what we're doing is interrupting the water supply going from the external inlet to the rest of your rig with this filter and PRV. Now you want a location for the filter housing in particular that you can access to change out the filter, which, you know, for most folks is probably going to be once a year or every 2 years, just kind of depending on how much you use your RV. Here in the NoBo 10.6, that was pretty easy to pick this location as the city water inlet comes in here to the right, and then it goes to feed the rest of the rig. And so I can easily put the equipment here, have easy access to change out that filter and adjust the PRV if needed. Now on the fifth wheel, the wet bay is just a little bit different. I chose to put the water filter housing over here off to the side where it's out of the way, but I can still get access to change it out. And then if you can see up here, I tucked the PRV back behind the wet bay panel where it's out of the way because this is not something that I really need access to. I set it once and I'm done. So that gives you an idea of how to plan out where to put everything. But let me touch next on the specific connections. And as I said earlier in the video, this is a DIY project. So if you've never done any plumbing whatsoever, especially with PEX, you can still do this. It's really pretty simple. In the RV industry, PEX plumbing is pretty much the universal standard across the brand. So that's probably what you already have in your rig. Now there are all sorts of different PEX fittings and brands of fittings, but in the RV industry, almost all the manufacturers use the Apollo branded system. And let me just show you what one of those crimp rings looks like. Here you can see it's a ring that goes around the fitting and the pipe, and then it gets crimped to make it watertight. And in the RV industry, almost every rig is going to have these type fittings. And out of all the different PEX systems and fittings, I think these are probably one of the easiest to install. And again, I'm not a professional plumber by any means, but these are super easy to use. And so if you've never done plumbing before, you can definitely do these types of fittings. Now you can see here on our install, we've got some different types of fittings. We've got elbows here. We've got some that are threaded that connect onto the threads of this water filter housing. And then we've got these little crimp rings that go around the pipes and make these fittings watertight. So let me show you real quickly how easy it is to do one of these Apollo style crimp rings. So right here, we've got a 1/2 inch PEX line, and it doesn't matter what brand you go with. As long as it's PEX, it's going to have the same inner and outer diameter. Color doesn't matter either. That's just to distinguish between hot from cold. So you can do blue, red, or white. It doesn't matter what color. Then over here, we've got a fitting, a PEX fitting, and you can see here it's going to have these little ribs, and it slides into your PEX piping just like this. But you can see how it's loose. It's snug, but it's still loose, and so obviously this is not going to be watertight. So what we do is we take one of these crimp rings and we slide it onto the PEX pipe first, and then we take our fitting and slide it into the pipe. Then we take this Apollo crimping tool and we're going to crimp this ring onto the fitting here, onto the pipe, so that this connection becomes watertight. And again, if you've never done any plumbing before, don't worry, this is super simple, and I'm going to show you exactly how these crimp rings work. So this is the Apollo PEX crimping system, and you can see here on this ring, it's got a little notch here at the top, And then over here on the crimping tool, it's almost like a giant set of pliers. And you can see the opening is specially formed to receive the top of this ring here. And so when this is on your pipe, and I'll show you just a minute, it goes inside to this pliers. And then you squeeze the jaws on the pliers, and it basically squeezes this nose here on top and makes the connection tight all the way around your PEX fitting and pipe. All right, so let me do a sample fitting and crimp it down so you can see just how easy this is. So right here I've got my PEX pipe. I'm going to slide my crimp ring onto the PEX pipe. You can see it slides on loose. And then I'm going to take a fitting. This is just an elbow. You may have a threaded connection. You may have a coupler. Just kind of depends on your install, but all the fittings are going to insert into the PEX the same way. Then we're going to take our crimp ring and we're going to slide it over so that it's just about an 1/8 inch from the edge of our fitting here. So you can see it's right about there. And that way when we crimp down on it, it's going to crimp down onto the pipe, onto the fitting, and secure that and make it watertight. And we're kind of right in the center here, you can see on those ribs. So that's how far over we want to go. And then crimping it is as easy as taking this crimping tool here, and we're going to open our jaws all the way up. So I've turned the camera so you can get a little better angle here, but basically I've got my crimping tool. It's going to come down and sit right on top of the nose of that fitting. And then I'm going to simply take my crimping tool, just like a pliers, and squeeze it. So you can see I'm squeezing it, and it does take a little bit of force. So you might have to take both your hands and squeeze together. And then when you're finished, the tool will open back up, and you can see now that it's crimped that nose. So now this nose is nice and tight, and you can see here I can't turn the fitting anymore, and that's because this crimp ring has securely crimped all the way around the PEX piping and secured it to that particular fitting. And that's how easy it is to use the Apollo system with these crimp rings. The only other tool you really need when working with PEX is having a good cutter. You can use a box cutter to cut PEX, but you just want to make sure it's cut square and perpendicular. Whereas if you buy an inexpensive PEX cutter like this one here, it's super easy and it makes sure that your cuts are always perpendicular. You can see how easy it just cuts like butter. Gives you a nice square cut. So if you're watching this video and you've never done a plumbing project before in your life, I hope that gives you a little confidence that you can do these Apollo crimp ring style fittings for PEX. And like I said before, they are widely used in the RV industry already. That's probably what's on your rig right now, so why not keep it consistent, right? But let me throw out one other option. These are shark bite fittings. You've probably heard of them before. They just slide right on and connect all sorts of different kinds of pipes. You certainly could use these as well instead of doing the Apollo crimp rings. I think the downside of these is that on an RV, things are vibrating and shaking and moving and rattling, while you're moving the rig. And so I think these potentially could have the opportunity to come loose over time. Probably not. I think really the Apollo crimp rings are easy enough. That's the way to go. But if you're just not comfortable with those, you might want to look at these shark bite fittings as an alternative. But now let me walk through the specific install of the water filter housing and the PRV. And first, let me comment on the order of the filter in the PRV. Should you put the PRV first or the water filter? In other words, from your external water inlet, should the PRV come first or should the water filter housing come first? Well, in my experience, it's best to put the filter first and then the PRV after that. And let me explain why. So both of these devices are going to slow your water pressure down, right? The water has to force its way through the filter, tiny little holes, right? And that's going to slow the water pressure down. The PRV is also going to slow the water down in most cases, except if the water is already under that threshold that you set. In other words, if you set your PRV to 40 PSI and the water going into the pressure reducing valve is at or under 40 PSI, it's not going to slow it down anymore, whereas the filter is inherently always going to slow that water pressure down. So if you're at a campsite that doesn't have great water pressure coming from the city water connection here, then putting that water filter first ensures that your water pressure isn't going to be any worse off compared to slowing it down in the PRV first and then slowing it down again in the water filter housing. So in my opinion, again, I think it's best to always put the water filter housing first, let the water slow down just a little bit there, and then have it slow down at a controlled rate in your PRV. Our goal in using a PRV is we want a consistent 40 to 50 PSI coming into our rig. And so we want that last after the filter in order to ensure that rate is consistent and flowing into our rig at a desirable 40 to 50 PSI. Now, as for the connections, the PEX connections, you can see here I used a combination of elbows, and then I've got a threaded one that's going into the actual water filter housing. You can use metal like this one here, or you can use plastic fittings. It really doesn't make a difference. If you're using metal and you're threading them into a plastic water filter housing like I did here, you're gonna have to use some pipe dope or pipe sealant, something to make that metal to plastic connection solid so that you don't have drips afterward. And it basically just becomes like a puzzle. So you're going from the back side of this city water connection and rerouting the pipes so that you can go into your water filter first, out of the water filter into the PRV, and then back into your existing water supply to the rig. You want to do as few connections as possible, and you want to make sure everything is watertight. Another consideration is you want to make sure you support the water filter housing and your PRV, because remember, when your RV is bouncing down the road, you don't want things that can jiggle or shake loose. And so right here you can see in the fifth wheel, I've taken the water filter housing, and most of them do have an L bracket. So I've screwed that L bracket into the frame of the floor below. And then for the PRV, I've supported it here with a copper clamp, and I've again screwed it to the underside of this, which is typically OSB on the underside of the floor above. Now here on the overlander, I ended up putting a piece of hardwood, kind of like a backer, to mount everything to. So you can see here I've got a piece of hardwood, and I just glued this to the luan and then put a few screws in it to make sure it was real secure. And then I just use these clips to support the pipe, which in turn supports the PRV. And then on the water filter housing, same thing. It's got an L bracket and just screwed right into that hardwood backer. So however you mount it, you just want to make sure everything is secure. Remember, every time you take your RV down the road, it's kind of like an earthquake and everything shakes and rattles. So you just want to make sure it is securely mounted. Once everything is installed, the only maintenance you have to do is perhaps once a year change out the cartridge, the filter inside here, and you just use a standard filter wrench that comes with most of these housings and just unscrew the rest by hand. You can get a variety of different filter cartridges. Remember, this is a standard 10-inch housing, so it doesn't matter what brand of filter cartridge. You can get any brand that fits a standard 10-inch housing. I really like this one here. It's a carbon wrapped filter, and then inside it has the more traditional sediment type filter. So this one does a great job overall at cutting down chlorine taste, cutting down different odors that might be in the water supply, but then also getting rid of the sediment and rust that might be in the water pipes feeding your rig. You can also get a more basic one like this one here. Again, this one's going to only pretty much trap sediment. It's not going to cut down on the chlorine and odors so much. I will leave links in the description below where you can get a filter housing and filter just like this one here. All right, final consideration. So you certainly could have 2 or 3 of these in series and do a more thorough filtration where each one of these has a specific type of cartridge inside designed to filter out maybe a specific type of impurity. In fact, there are some RV products where you have 2 or 3 of these in series and they're designed to go on the outside of your rig. I think the downside to using one of those or having more than one of these feeding your whole rig is that you risk stepping down the water pressure so low where, especially if you've got maybe a shower running and someone else washing their hands or using a kitchen sink, you risk stepping that water pressure down so low because it has to go through each one of those stages. And by the time it gets to your fixture, maybe the water pressure is not so hot. So you might be thinking, what if I want a better water filtration system for drinking water, but I don't want to have 2 or 3 stages of these filters and risk stepping down my water pressure to the point that it's undesirable, especially if you've got a shower running, or your kitchen sink running all at the same time. Well, my solution to that in my fifth wheel, what I've done is I have a dedicated water filtration faucet in the kitchen, and it has its own dedicated filter under the sink in addition to this single stage, and it's a more thorough system. And the benefit of doing it that way is if you have a dedicated water filter faucet in your kitchen, you can have a more thorough water filtration system on that particular faucet where maybe the water pressure isn't as important. And that way it doesn't slow down the water pressure in the rest of your rig. So that's my preferred way of filtering the water on my rig, but again, you certainly could put more than one of these in series if desired. Just be mindful of its potential impact on your rig's overall water pressure. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope you found it helpful. I am passionate about encouraging families to spend time together in the great outdoors. And I love to find ways to make the camping experience more efficient and less hassle so you can spend more time with your family. And that's really what this channel is all about. Now, there's going to be a lot of other videos coming up in this series on upgrades and mods that you definitely don't want to miss. So if you're not already subscribed, click that subscribe button. Be sure to click the notification bell as well so you don't miss a new video. Don't forget you can support the channel using the affiliate links in the description below. I will include links to all the different products you saw featured and installed here in this video. If you have any questions on the install, be sure to drop me a comment below. Thanks for watching.